Okay.
All right, it's good on your end?
Everything looks good from this end.
I am Matthew Corr, and I am here interviewing Ed Corr on May 18th, 2021, who's in Fontana, Wisconsin currently. Could we begin with talking about your childhood?
Sure. What do you want to know about my childhood?
When you said you were born in 1940, right? So could we talk about what your upbringing was like from then up until 1960?
Sure. When I was born, my family lived, my mom and dad lived with my grandmother and grandfather in an apartment on Henry Street, right across from the playground. I should say adjacent to the playground, to the little company, to the Little Flower School and Church. And so I can't remember my infancy exactly, but my first memories of doing anything were going to that church and meeting the nuns who thought I was just a beautiful little child, and then playing around with everybody in that playground because my house was right next door to it. And it was a great playground. So when I was a 3-year-old and began to walk, or a 2-year-old, whenever I began walking, I was playing with 5, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds in the playground next to me because that was what was there. We lived there till I was 3 years old. And when I was 3, we moved to Green Street to a different apartment. The reason was because my mother, the apartment we were in was too small, and my mother was expecting a second child. I was the firstborn. And my sister was born 6 months after we moved in to the new place on Green Street, Gresham area of Chicago. And then most of my early years before I started going to school, were spent with my playmates on that block. And we had a city block that contained that had probably 20 or 30 children, maybe even, from ages 5 through 14. And we kind of all played together. Obviously, the 14-year-olds didn't want to play with the 5-year-olds very much, but we kind of all knew each other and were part of, the same group. I then went to school at St. Leo Grammar School, which was about a mile away. At first, my mother or father, either one or the other, would walk me to the school we were doing. And this was kind of difficult because my father was a policeman full time, and my mother was a worker at a company called Foot and Company, which manufactured key parts to airplanes. And it was a big time for that. And a lot of women were working doing this stuff because it was during the Second World War. And so they're doing stuff to, keep the production flowing and keeping us winning the war and beat those Japs. So, and that was a big thing when I was growing up, was the fact that we were at war. They talked about the war. They talked about Hitler. They talked about the Japanese. They talked about a lot of things that were going on and why they were going on. And it's kind of what you heard and saw. But most of this information came from the newspapers, which I was probably not reading. I don't recall doing that. Or from the radio. The radio was kind of a big source of entertainment. So besides playing with the kids on my block and going to and from school, we did a lot of radio listening. And the programs back then that I was listening to were like Bob Hope and Bing Crosby and Inner Sanctum and Jack Benny, and some of the kinds of things you probably never heard of. But our somewhat famous for their importance in that era. I do remember sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, and it was the day that they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and they actually they broadcast that over the radio, which was really kind of interesting. And I remember it distinctly because it was a Sunday dinner, and there were people at our house for that Sunday dinner besides my mom and dad and grandparents. One of my uncles was a was a corpsman in the Marine Corps. Actually, he was in the Navy as a corpsman, but he was assigned to a Marine Corps unit, and he had spent time on Guadalcanal and was wounded, and was also disabled because of malaria that he caught while he caught on Guadalcanal. So he was there, and his fiance was there, and a couple of my uncles and their wives and children were there. So it was quite a big gathering. And, everybody kind of sat around the table and listened to the historical and eventful dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima. The next kinds of things I remember mostly are having to walk to school every day. And then when my sister got old enough to go to school, I'd have to walk with her, which I really didn't want to do, but I had to for a while. And then we had another sister come along and another brother come along. And by the time I was in 8th grade, I had 2 sisters walking my youngest brother to grammar school at St. Leo Grammar School. And I left Leo Grammar School. Probably the most significant thing during that period of time, though, is that my uncle got me a job caddying at Beverly Country Club, which was probably 3 or 4 miles away. But for my 9th birthday, I had gotten a two-wheel bike, and I could ride the bike over to 87th and Western, which is where the entrance to Beverly Country Club was. And it was an easy commute. Nobody had to take me or leave me or do any of that, or pick me up, do any of that stuff. And I was an 11-year-old. As an 11-year-old, I was doing this, and that was my first job, and I really kind of liked it because I liked being outdoors. I never knew anything about golf until I went to this job, but learned a little bit about golf while I was doing it. I kind of liked golf, and it was a nice experience for a young person in terms of socialization, because I caddied for people. The first year it was mostly women who were involved in the social or in society on the South. So my grandmother, my
I'm sorry,
father.
real quick.
Sure.
Could you go back? You were at the part mentioning about how it was these women you were caddying for were involved in social circles when everything froze for a minute. So I was just asking if you could go back and restate that.
Sure. As I said, I was caddying for the first year. I caddied mostly for women, and they were involved in social circles, and that were somewhat important in terms on the south side of Chicago, and also, as a matter of fact, in the whole political atmosphere of Chicago. So I kind of got to know some famous people, but they to somebody not from Chicago, they probably would have little meaning. But I gained a reputation because some of them realized that I was, by my last name, that I was related to an ex-Chicago mayor. And that was on my father's side. My father's mom was the sister of Mayor Kelly, Kelly, who was a mayor in Chicago in the 30s and 40s. And Mary Kelly married John Corr, and John and Mary had Ed, and Ed, my mom, had me. So that's kind of the lineage there. But the Corr was also a cousin, a distant cousin in the family lineage, who was the alderman who took over the mayoral duties when Cermak was assassinated in the 30s. Mayor Cermak was shot during a visit from President Roosevelt, and the attempt was really on Roosevelt's life, but the assassin missed and shot Cermak, and he served a couple year period until they could reelect another mayor whose name was Kennelly. But Mayor Kelly, among his proteges was Mayor Daley, who at the time that I began caddying was then the mayor, just became the mayor of Chicago. Actually, Kennelly was, but Kelly came right after that, or Daley came right after that. And then, so I had a reputation preceded me, but I wasn't aware that I was that famous among those people. But at any rate, I really liked the job. I liked intermingling. I thought it was a great job to enhance the socialization skills of a young man, and I enjoyed doing it. I then began caddying for my second and third year caddying. I began caddying for people that were a little more into the game of golf. So I learned a lot more about golf, and I gained a good reputation as being a good caddy. You get that because when they pay you, they essentially write a scorecard on each caddy, and they kept track of how well people thought you had caddied for them. And what happened is that on a couple of occasions when we had esteemed guests, one occasion that I can remember vividly is that Bing Crosby came out and played golf at Beverly Country Club with the then pro Charlie Penna, whose brother was a California professional golfer, but he was more in the manufacturing end of golf, and he was one of the original designers of the McGregor. He had two other boys. I can't remember what their names were, but they were part of the group.
I'm sorry again, but it cut out again when you were talking about how he was the designer of McGregor.
Yeah.
And then it cut out. So sorry to ask this again, but could you restate that?
Yeah. Well, Tony Penna, Charlie's brother, was a famous pro in California because he and a couple of other people started the McGregor Golf Club business, and Tony was the designer of these clubs. And many of the clubs were very unique and were the predecessors of the basically modern day weighted toe heel stuff that is being produced now. So that he was an innovator that used essentially physics and science to develop streamlined and golf clubs that could hit the ball further, maintain its flight course better, that kind of thing. And he was a friend of Crosby's. So when Crosby was coming to the Midwest, he got the connection through his brother to come and play Beverly Country Club, and that's how I got to caddy for them. I also caddied about the same time in a golf match. It was one of the first televised golf matches, and it was called All-Star Golf. And at the time, because the TV cameras were so big and so heavy and so problematic to control, they had to play only 9 holes at a time because they had to move the cameras from one hole to the next in order to follow the golfers. And so that was a great golf event, if in the sense that I got to caddy for some important people. The match that I caddied in was Sam Snead versus Kerry Milkoff, who was the Open champion, the U.S. Open champion, and Snead had won just about every other kind of tournament by then, and so they were playing an 18-hole match. I caddied for they called Beverly to get caddies, and I caddied for Snead. Cropped up, but Snead got very mad at me because on the 8th hole or the 9th hole, which was the last hole we were shooting the first day of this match, he asked me to club him, and I didn't know any yardages or anything about this country club. I'd never even been to this golf course before. It was at a course where they played the last few Western Opens, Cog Hill, and I recommended a club to him, although we hadn't done a lot of talking with each other than him being kind of insulting. And it was a rock club, and he hit the ball so far, it flew over the green, it hit the clubhouse wall, careened back, and almost came back as far as we were. So he had to hit another shot. He really had everybody in hysterics, particularly Middlecoff. But at any rate, the next day, when we started filming for the 10th through the 18th holes, we got about 3/4 of the way out on the 10th hole, and Snead was giving basically being very rude. And he was kind of an ignorant man, I'm sorry to say, but he was being very rude, and I just got to the point where I said I didn't care about this. I don't have to take this. And I basically told them, caddy for yourself, carry your own bag. And I threw the bag down and left. And when I started walking back to the clubhouse, the announcer on the program, his name was Jack Brickhouse, who was a famous Chicago sports announcer, came running after me, hey kid, come on, you got to come back. You can't do this. We got a whole television crew here, and we got to do this today. We can't do it if we don't finish it. And so they pretty much begged me to come back, and what really got me to go back was they said they were going to tell the people at the country club at Beverly that recommended me for this job how I had reacted in this case. And I wasn't sure that I was in the right, but I didn't want that going back there. So I did go back and I did finish it. And at the end, they allowed the caddies to go in and shower with the pros. And so I was in taking a shower, and Snead and Middlecoff and the other caddy that was with me, his name was Carl Gertz, were all in the shower area, in the locker room area. And then the press came in and they were questioning the two golfers about the match. And the Middlecoff had won $25,000, which back then was a lot of money. And Snead was the runner-up in the match. He only got $5,000. But they started talking about what Middlecoff. Well, you can ask my caddy, and if he wants to tell you how much you gave him, that's okay with me. And it could come right from him. But he said, what I really think you guys ought to ask is how much did Sneed tip his caddy? And basically, and Sneed had not tipped his caddy anything. And basically, Middlecoff embarrassed him in front of all these people to the point where he went to his locker and came back with some money to tip the caddy, me, which was kind of nice because it was $100 that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Although I did make money for the caddying, actually, WGN TV paid me for the caddying episode. But that kind of episode, I found out later, did get back to Beverly, and nobody was really upset with me. They thought that I had done the right thing, that it was a good thing, and it kind of taught me a lesson that when, if people don't treat you the way you should be treated, you should do something about it. Whatever that is, I don't know. But, in this case, leaving was probably the right thing to do. But that was part of my growing up. And also involved with that growing up part was the fact that caddying enabled me to be eligible to apply for the Evans Scholarship, which is a scholarship given out by the Western Golf Association to caddies at its member clubs. And caddies, you had to show that you were needy, that you couldn't afford to go to college on your own. You didn't have the finances to do that, or your family didn't. And you had to test well on the ACTs and SATs. And you had to be in the upper 10% of your high school graduating class. And you had to have a minimum of a B+ average in your grades. And be recommended by people from the country club where you caddy. And I was fortunate enough to be a winner of one of the scholarship awards, from which I chose to go to Marquette University, which was at the time, one of the 8 chapters in the program. So I went to Marquette University, and during the period from the time I was about 16 until I got out of college, I had to earn basically money to keep myself and everything going. I paid basically my own high school tuition, and I paid my own expenses in the sense that I bought my own clothes, did those kind of things. Because my father had died when I was 9 years old, and my mother, and there was just a meager pension from that, and my mother had to stop working for a while because from her war work experience, and so we were at a pretty big loss for income. So we were trying to keep that going. Then I'm kind of sorry, I lost my train of thought. Can you help me with that, man? Where was I going with that?
You just ended talking about your caddy scholarship, and we're talking about how you needed B+ grades.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I just didn't want to leave that area of my life empty in this thing for you, because also during that period, my uncle got me the job caddying, and another uncle, my mother's brother, got me jobs doing things with the Chicago Park District, and my uncle that got me the job caddying got me jobs on construction. So when I was 16 and 17, I worked for the Chicago Park District doing maintenance work at different parks around my neighborhood, which was really kind of nice. And it was a fun job. You were, again, like caddying, you're outside. You got to meet all the people in the park, not only the people that you work for, but the people that were enjoying the benefits of the park. And then I started working construction, and I started as a laborer doing construction on what is now the Dan Ryan Expressway, and I was involved with the building of all the bridges from the railroad bridge at 99th Street to the street bridges at 79th, 76 and 71st Street on the Dan Ryan, and the paving of the roadway from 99th Street to 69th Street, which really basically took, because there was a lot of demolition and other work that had to be done to prepare the highway to be prepared. It took about 3 years. So that really kept me busy. And I fortunately worked most of the time with cement finishers and got a chance to apply for a union card as a cement finisher, which I did. And I held a card as a cement finisher from 1962 until almost 1972, when I figured I probably didn't need this card anymore. I just kind of kept it as a fallback in case I ever needed something another job to do. But at any rate, when I left Marquette High, beginning to go pretty strong. And I was kind of leery at the end of being drafted. I didn't want to be drafted. So I joined the Marine Corps as a reservist. And so I did all the preparatory training. I think we talked about this in my preemptive interview. I did a boot camp and advanced infantry training, and I did some Marine Corps school stuff in radio technology, because I was assigned as a reservist to a reserve unit in Chicago that was a radio communications unit. My job in the Marine Corps was as a radio relay operator, and in the infantry sense, when you are a radio relay operator, what you do is you drive a truck, which is really a housing for a bunch of different radios that can pick up different frequencies and messages. And with a portable tower that acts as an aerial, you can dismantle the tower and rebuild it. So you can move from location to location and rebuild it, dismantle it when you're leaving and rebuild it when you arrive at your new location. And the locations that were chosen were generally someplace closer to the front lines, because your responsibility was to relay messages from frontline observers back to people in command, and to the people that could be supportive to the units up front in terms of being artillery support and shelling and stuff like that. You give directions where they go, what they shoot at, how far they shoot, the coordinates. You give the coordinates off a map, that kind of stuff, which was kind of interesting. Stuff. And during that period of time, I did various jobs during the summer camps. Our unit kind of changed. They were beginning to close the unit down, and the next nearest unit was at Glenview Naval Air Station in Glenview, Illinois, which was an air station, a Marine Corps air station. So my unit went from being an infantry support unit to being a naval air support unit. So the task then changed from relaying messages from forward observers to relaying messages from airplanes. So you were like the communication in the same way I was. When you were in the infantry, you were relaying these back to artillery units. You would be relaying stuff to the Marine Corps flyers who were coming in to support the infantry wherever they were fighting. So it was interesting stuff. Matt, you wanted me to go from when I went in as a private in the Marine Corps. That's a guy that walks around with no stripes or chevrons. And I came out as a corporal, which is an E4. So you go from private to private first class to lance corporal to corporal. And that's how you're 4 steps up the ladder from the bottom. And when I left the Marine Corps, that's what I left as a E4. The tours that I did while I was in reserve were at Quantico, Virginia, at Fort, actually at New River in near Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, New River Bogue Sound, and at 29 Ponds, California, and San Diego, California, the Miramar Naval Base. And you probably, if you saw the Top Gun movie, that's the station that I was at. And I'm not sure whether I'm missing any. But I did. Oh yeah, I did the one at Coronado. We did because that was a training for amphibious landings. That's how you get on and off the boat and how you swim in and do all that kind of stuff. I think I told Matt in the last one that was all real good and it was fun because it was kind of like a vacation in the sense that you were outside in the sun doing pretty neat stuff. But one of the qualifications or one of the tests or skills that you had to demonstrate in this training was that you had to be able to swim in from 1,000 yards offshore. And when we did the shore swim, we do them in teams. You did them in teams so that you could watch out for each other. Nobody disappeared from the group. It's kind of bad when they drown guys out there. They don't like to do that. But the guy that I was with was afraid of the water. Actually, he just learned to swim with what we were doing in this training thing. And when we jumped in, he kind of panicked, and I thought he was going to drown me, but I finally got him to calm down, and we got in, and it actually turned out to be a very, very easy swim because salt water is so much more buoyant than fresh water. I kind of made him realize that, and then when he calmed down, and we just kind of floated in with the tide. It was really what started out as kind of a bad experience turned into be a really pretty good one. That was my whole Marine Corps experience. Then I started to when I
Real
got
quick,
started,
I wanted to ask about, since you mentioned something during the pre-interview, and that was your sharpshooter certification.
oh yeah, when you're at ATR, the Marine Corps considers everybody a rifleman, no matter what your military occupational specialty is. And so everybody has to qualify with a rifle. And I qualified as a sharpshooter, which is like three steps up from qualification. And I did get a medal for that. That was kind of a fun thing. But that was the extent of my medals. I didn't come away with any others.
You also completed while at that amphibious training course, they had you mentioned during the pre-interview again that they had you do a Navy SEAL,
Oh yeah,
what the modern term would be, but frogman back then, training course.
right. They had the UDT, Underwater Demolition Team, which was the proper military name for what they were then calling frogmen. And they had the obstacle course for them, and there at Coronado Island, and they wanted all of us that were doing this training to go through that obstacle course, which I did. And then it was more difficult than I expected, but it was pretty good. What I fortunately was capable of doing it, and many others weren't, but I was one of the few. Less than 50% of the guys I was there with passed that could do that obstacle course. So that was yeah, I did do that. Forgot about that. So now I'm back to what the rest of my life was and how I got to be your grandpa, I guess. Huh?
Yes.
I did that. I had you. I had you in mind all along, and I was thinking, boy, I'm going to have a grandson, and I want him to be proud of me. So this is where I'm going to go. I'm going to use I graduated from my tech with a Bachelor of Arts degree, but I had a minor in history. I had a minor in mathematics. My major was in history. And I kind of used my history background to get a job with AT&T. And at the time, one of the things they did was they put public telephones out for use by people in public because there were no cell phones at the time. Cell phones hadn't been developed yet. And so in bars and in restaurants and in gas stations, on street corners, there were all these posts of telephones that you could use. And they called them public telephones because they were there available. You had to insert coins in them to make them work. And one of the problems with them is if the coins overloaded, if they got too full, they jammed the phones, and then the phones wouldn't do the job that they were there for, which was bad because it upset people that wanted to make a phone call, and also it was bad because the company wasn't making the money that it wanted to make off that phone because it was idle and incapable of use for a period of time. So I was involved with a team of guys that developed a program called COIN, which stood for Coin Information and Operational Network. It was a how many coins went in, what the denominations of the coins were, in order to predict when you would collect it, how long it would go between collections. And the timing of this was that you wanted to make this happen so that when you collected it, it was almost ready to go to that point where it would jam up and wouldn't work, because that's when the receptacle was at its maximum in terms of capacity of filled with coins. And that wasn't too hard. It wasn't too easy to do because the coins being used were nickels, dimes, quarters, and you had to try to understand how those filled the receptacles. So actually the volume of each of those coins was important in terms of creating the data that would be helpful in terms of predicting when it should be collected. Essentially, what happened is that we developed a volume criteria, which was called nickel equivalent. And so we predicted the way we wrote the programs were to use the assumptions that every coin that was going to be put in that telephone was going to be a nickel, because the nickel is by volume the biggest of those three coins. It's obviously bigger than a dime, but it is actually bigger than a quarter too, because of its depth. The depth on a nickel, it is deeper than it is on a quarter, and the volume is a better indicator of what volume that receptacle would accept. And so we developed the nickel equivalent theory, and finally a theory of how that source of revenue to that telephone. And so every time that you collect it, it's measured. And so they could then predict pretty much after 2 or 3 times when it had to be collected again. some indication of the volume of that is that just in Chicago at O'Hare Field, there were over 700 public telephones, and they collected, and most of those phones were collected twice weekly. Some of them were collected once weekly, and some of them were collected daily, depending upon where their location was in the airport. It would determine how much use they would get. So we would collect those phones, and we would collect in the airport on a daily basis. And the average amount of money we collected at O'Hare Field was over $1 million. So I don't know if you can imagine what $1 million in nickels, dimes, and quarters looks like, but it fills a couple of trucks, a couple of bank trucks. So that went on, and based upon that job, I had a headhunter come looking for me because of my familiarity with predictive programming, and wanted me to come and sell a program that had just been developed in the credit reporting industry, and it was developed by a company called Union Tank Car. Union Tank Car, obviously, when it was broken away, Standard Oil became TransUnion, and its function stayed the same, but it didn't only supply tank cars for the railroad industry or the fuel industry. It provided coal cars. It provided all kinds of other equipment that could be rented, which is essentially what they did with the cars. They rented the coal cars, the oil tank cars. They rented mostly hospital beds in most of the hospitals throughout the United States. They rented other very highly expensive equipment that hospitals could afford paying for it on a by-use basis, but couldn't basically afford to lay out the capital to bring those things in. And essentially, they were in the equipment rental business, and one of the big things they rented were ocean-going tugs, which would travel all over the world, as would the tank cars. They would go from one place to another and be all over. So they had the same problem we had with telephones, in the sense that they had to know where all these things were. And so they brought in a whole team of analysts to develop ways to keep track of them. And once they did that and developed those programs, these people were kind of obsolete in the business, other than the few that they needed to maintain the programs. And they were concerned about letting this large group of very talented people with very specific skills leave their employ. And by chance, the credit bureau of Cook County, which was at the time the largest credit bureau in the world, was kind of going under, and they were looking for a way to develop a system to do their job. I'll give you some background on their job in a bit, but they and the First National Bank of Chicago, Marshall Fields, there was another owner. There were three investors. There were three investors at the credit bureau that wanted to keep it going. I think it may have been Continental Bank was the other one at the same time. But at any rate, they were trying to dump the credit bureau to somebody who could manage developing this system for doing the work in a credit bureau. And so they sold the credit bureau of Cook County for $1 and other considerations to TransUnion. And TransUnion then used these skilled people that they were potentially going to lay off to develop a credit reporting program, which was called Cronus, standing for Credit Reporting Online, Credit Reporting Online Network Utility System. And Cronus essentially would accept information from creditors that came via their accounts receivable tapes and fill all that information into an individual profile, so that if you had an account with one of the banks, or you had a mortgage with one of the banks, or if you had a car loan somewhere with a bank or with a car dealer or a car company, or you had or you had credit with a retailer, they would gather this information from the accounts to order from these clients, who essentially were keeping track of these people because they were people that they had extended credit to, and they just trying to think of that. Well, they essentially created a file in order to have a source, essentially a library, for whom from whom credit bureaus could gather information on people all over. So if I, for example, Matthew, were using you as an example of an individual, and you had 3 or 4 loans, and I would be accepting that information. There's other information besides loan and finance information, but for the purposes of this, we'll just talk about the finance side. I would be gathering your information and putting it all in one file that I could pull up on a screen, or from an electronic source, from a file, because it would all be compiled together, and it would not occupy because it's being filed electronically, it obviously doesn't occupy tremendous amounts of space. Then what happens is that when you apply for credit again to someone else with whom you had no experience, that creditor could come to me and see what your experience was with other creditors and use that information to determine whether or not they wanted to extend you credit. So it's kind of a vicious circle in a way. Other information that was gathered was not quite so electronic, but it was important to gather. It was court record information, whether you had filed bankruptcy, whether you owned a home, those kinds of things, and collection information, which came from the credit companies that were in the collection business, who were trying to collect money from creditors who had become negligent on their accounts. So all that information and the demographic information on each individual, which is basically taken directly from the individual. They don't necessarily come in and give the credit. Which worked as the source to attract, like a magnet, to attract all the information from other creditors to that source. And it became quite a big thing. The TransUnion started going into the credit reporting business full time, and we're trying to sell this program that they had developed for the Cook County Credit Bureau to other credit bureaus around the country. But to get back to that, the issue of how it was done before this, the Chicago opportunity is kind of an interesting one to talk about, because the Cook County Credit Bureau, before they were converted into an electronic recorder, actually had they owned a building. It was the old Gimbel's retail warehouse, which was a big building that had all concrete pillars and concrete floors, and it's where they kept the paper information that was coming in on people prior to the modernizing of this into electronic data. And they would give the files were all done alphabetically, and they occupied 7 floors and each floor was probably 100 yards long and 40 or 50 yards wide. And these were files with paper in them, which if you didn't have a building like they were fortunate to find here, it could certainly drop right to the basement every time because of the weight of it all. But they then posted telephone jacks in the pillars that were supporting these businesses. And the way they got the information, if you called in, and your name began with a C, like Corr, they would send this to a telephone jack station that was the closest open that was available to the C files. And a girl on that floor would plug into the jack, and you would tell her who you were inquiring upon, and she would go and get the information out of the file. And the way they speeded up this whole process was all these girls, and this was a qualification for the job, were on roller skates. So you had to learn, if you couldn't roller skate, you couldn't do this job. And they would, when a jack signaled on, they would skate over, plug into the jack, leave their connection there after they got the information, skate to the file, pick up the file, skate back to the telephone, and be able to relay the information to the customer that was seeking it. So all that could be done away with through the electrification of it. Then they got much more sophisticated about the use of this information, and they were taking the information to develop programs that would predict stuff that would indicate how they could market to you, for example. Because of how you had been shopping in the past, there would be information on there from the retailers or the other people that had been extending you credit. And they could then predict that Nancy Corr would be a real likely candidate, or be somebody that would possibly be interested in buying a jet airplane or whatever else you might be interested. So they could market specifically to you. And also, they also got very predictive about how good you would react to extending new credits, so that when solicitors were looking for new customers and they were sending out pre-approved credit report stuff, that was all because they could get information from these credit bureaus that was predictive about how they would react if they had been extended additional credit. So while I was doing that, I was involved with that essentially more as a speaker, and I understood the concept of all of that and could relate to it and kind of get down and dirty and explaining it, talking about it. What I really was hired to do by TransUnion was to sell this program to manual credit bureaus around the country. And one of my first customers was the Credit Bureau of Milwaukee, one of the first people I was trying to sell. And I also had sales in a lot of other places around the country: Spokane, Washington, Seattle, Washington, Reno, Nevada. Let me think. Let's go east: Toledo, Ohio, Youngstown, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio. There are several credit bureaus in the Finger Lakes in New York where I also sold, and to many credit bureaus, a lot of credit bureaus in New England, Manchester, New Hampshire, Portland, Maine. Never was successful in Boston, but I was successful in New Haven, Connecticut. But at any rate, as I did this and traveled around the country seeing these places, I thought, boy, you know, the job on the other side of this desk is better than this job. I mean, I like this job, but it takes me away from my family a lot. I'm flying all the time. You get tired of living out of a suitcase. Let me see if I could do this another way. And uh, the credit bureaus in the Fox Valley of Wisconsin were at the time, if you combined all their efforts, were as big or bigger than Milwaukee, and they were looking to automate. And their problem was that one of the problems was that none of them were big enough to really afford this because they were smaller. They were smaller companies, but combined, they were they had the opportunity. So I pitched them on letting me become an owner and using their investment in the manual credit bureaus to combine them all together to create a company called Credit Data Services of Wisconsin. And we automated Credit Data Services of Wisconsin and took in the information from all of these credit bureaus. The bureaus that were involved were Fanac, Oshkosh, Appleton, Needham and Ashe, I should say, because that's kind of how that group went. Manitowoc, Manitowoc Two Rivers, and the Credit Bureau of Green Bay. So I then moved my family up there to help coordinate this and develop this program for them. And we did develop that credit bureau. And during my time there, we got it running well enough that I was kind of didn't have a lot to do. I mean, I wasn't a real busy camper, but I was talking to my old customer, Milwaukee, and they were looking for someone new to come in to run their credit bureau. And I said, well, if I didn't have to give up my ownership, could I? And did you know about it? You fully know about it. There's no conflict of interest in so I'm living up to my fiduciary responsibility to you and to them. Is that an opportunity that you would extend me if I stayed an owner? And they said, yeah. So I came and I worked for Milwaukee. When I came to Milwaukee, the credit bureau was about $1 million company. And I stayed there. I had a tenure there of 11 years at the credit bureau. We bought several other credit bureaus, Cross, Rockford, Illinois, West Bend, Wisconsin. I'm trying to think who else. Fort Atkinson. We bought a lot of other little credit bureaus and did the same thing using Milwaukee as the source for all that. And the company went from an $1 million company over an 8 or 9 year period to about a $21 million company. So the people that I was working for there were pretty happy with that kind of achievement, and they compensated me accordingly. And along the line, it's one of the credit bureaus they decided to buy were Credit Data Services of Wisconsin, in which I was a part owner. So they essentially bought me out of my ownership up there by buying that company. And I was, at the end, when we wound up selling the Credit Bureau of Milwaukee and its companies back to TransUnion. So I was actually a proprietor when that happened, and had a proprietary interest and made a few dollars to help me retire and to help pay for my children's education and to do those kinds of things, which was good because, you know, your dad spent a lot of money going away to South Bend, Indiana, and going to law school, although a lot of that stuff he did on himself. You know, he had scholarships still waiting for him here when he came back for law school from his high school days, from his achievements in high school. So that was a great thing. And so then I'm harking back to thinking about, that Matthew guy is gonna be coming along pretty soon. And that, we gotta get his father married somehow.
No,
So,
no offense. Oh, I
yeah,
almost called you Urac. No offense, Mr. Corr.
yeah.
We are coming to a close on our time.
Oh,
So
okay.
I would like to, so this is just the 60-minute mark. So at any point after this, it's more just extra. So I would like to ask, since we have exceeded the, with the mention of my dad, we're going about into the 80s at this point,
Yeah.
which while interesting is a little off topic in 50s and 60s.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Well,
is
it's
there,
gotta come to an end sometime. And
yeah.
the
So
50s,
is there anything else you'd like to add in addition about like your caddying or like what you did when any
well, I
additional
think,
stories from the
ob-
Marine Corps or
obviously, I think the caddying was a big thing because it provided me my education and sent me on to Marquette University and kind of got me into the swing of what I basically ended up doing. And I stayed affiliated with the Western Open for years after I left. I still do as a contributor to the scholarship fund. But I also worked when they were having the tournaments. I worked in the tournaments, and in the last couple of times I was at a tournament as an Evans Scholar, I was there in the capacity of being the chairman of the volunteer portion of the tournament. So I had a pretty good background in running golf tournaments. That also got me a job, the volunteer job with with the Greater Milwaukee Open. So I sat on the board there for a while too. But that's about all I can add that I can think of. Uh, what else did I tell you we should talk about? Politics.
yeah, the
I,
Chicago
I kind of
politics.
touched. I kind of touched on that with with my grandfather's and my Corr and Kelly relations in the Chicago public domain. So that I'm kind of I didn't know I had gone for an hour. I didn't know I was capable of doing that. But you kind of wore me out.
You led a very interesting life during these times.
I did.
So if that's it, thank you for taking the time out of your day to come do this interview.
You're welcome.
You you remembered almost every single one of my talking points from the pre-interview. I barely had to ask a thing,
Okay, good.
which was it was very interesting to hear you go into more depth about your time at TransUnion.
Oh, very good.
So thank you for your time.
Thank you for asking me, and anytime I can help you, I certainly will be glad to do so.
Not a problem, and thank you. And that is it.